Hello and welcome to this video. And on this video I am going to explore the difference between fusion and prog. It's come up over and over again and one of my lovely viewers on this channel, I can't remember who it was, but I'm sure they'll put a message in down below, said, maybe you could explore what the difference is between fusion and prog, and I thought that's an excellent thing to do, and I'm going to do that for the next 20 minutes. I haven't planned this, I'm just going to start talking. Right, we could list all the obvious surface differences. We could say that fusion has a lot more improvisation, it has a lot more emphasis on funk and groove, prog has a lot more playing set structures, i.e. no improvisation, and that it's a lot more based upon classical forms. Of course, there's many prog bands that don't follow that. There's many prog bands that are classed as prog bands when they're really fusion bands. I would imagine that would be a band like Brand X or Soft Machine. Soft Machine always gets mentioned as a pioneer of prog when they are just basically a fusion band. And there's instances with fusion where we're pretty close to prog, and I would cite the album Romantic Warrior by Return to Forever. But that is pretty much still an out-and-out fusion album. What makes the difference? It's the solos, right? It's the improvisation. But they're the surface details. I think it's much more interesting to think about the aesthetics. And the aesthetics of fusion are rooted in American black music forms, blues and jazz, right? There's elements of classical music in there because there's elements of classical music in all music. When the beboppers wanted to advance harmonically what they didn't invent their own harmonic system. They went into the harmonic system developed by impressionist composers like Debussy and Ravel. They start to look at extended chords, they start to look at sort of colour tones and later on modes. That's could be argued as a classical system as well. So that's in there. Certain jazz musicians who have explored more classical forms, which goes right back to Duke Ellington, but I'm thinking of people like Stan Kenton, Modern Jazz Quartet. That is very proggy jazz. It's sort of exploring the same area. So if you imagine it's like yin and yang, but fundamentally fusion is the exploration of sort of certain black Afro-American music forms and the integration of those back into rock. And I say back in, we're going to come to that in a minute. Prog is much more about the development of rock music using primarily European and I would say British aesthetic forms. Not just classical music, but also certain references to English literature, to mythology, stuff that posh kids like the guys in Genesis would have studied at Charterhouse. All that sort of what I call the English aesthetic, right? Now the English aesthetic's really interesting because the English aesthetic collides in the 1960s with black Afro-American music, with rhythm and blues. The Beatles are the perfect marriage between an English aesthetic which takes all those things on board, and in their case the English literature forms that they're pulling in would be almost like the nonsense of Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear, and they pull in things from the music hall as well, from George Formby, the sort of seaside postcard aspect in the English aesthetic, which is a very wide thing. If you take that and you marry that up with Afro-American music forms, jazz, blues, to some extent country, you put all that together, you get a thing called rock music. This is what the Stones were doing, this is what the Beatles were doing, this is what the Kinks were doing, the Small Faces were doing, this is what the Who were doing. And this is something that you have to get your head round, is that when we talk about fusion and prog, it's not like there was this style of music called rock music and then they said, hey, why don't we take this rock music and mix it with jazz. Rock music comes out of jazz, right? It comes out of jazz. The lineage would be jazz and blues. Jazz and blues are holding hands in the 1920s. It emerges as a form of music. It sells loads of records in America. And so they start to go, maybe we can mix jazz and blues with a bit of country. So country musicians, which is basically European folk music channeled through America, you then take that folk music and you marry that up with a jazz rhythm section, and suddenly you've got country and western. Gospel is the mixture of church music, religious music with jazz. Jazz sort of splits in the 40s with bebop into an artistic form, which is bebop, which is what everyone then classes as jazz. But there's another rhythm and blues aspect that comes out of people like Louis Jordan, and that moves into rock and roll. So rock and roll really can be seen as rhythm and blues mixed with country music. The whole thing's moving forward like this. What happens in England in the 1960s, and I've really argued this, is I think is the British then invented rock music as opposed to rock and roll. They really invented rock music. Of course, Bob Dylan plays a huge part of that. But what's Bob Dylan doing? He's going back through Woody Guthrie to that folk blues tradition. He's going back to that melting pot. So the point is, these things are bubbling around all the time. They're bubbling and weaving, right? In England, there's like a melting pot that starts up in the 1960s. And I think it's very, very important to the development of rock music. It's aided by Jim Marshall's invention of the Marshall amplifier, where you can take the guitar, right, and you can amplify it and distort it, and this almost gives you a weight where you could emulate the feeling of a big band, you know, the power. You can now emulate on guitar. You can sing, you can play solos that sound like horn players. The revolution happens because of Jim Marshall. And those bands like The Who and The Kinks and to some extent the Beatles, and then Graham Bond and the Blues Breakers, what you've got there is a melting pot of blues musicians and jazz musicians. People have come through skiffle, which again is like American folk music channeled through England and mixed with a sort of English aesthetic again. So if you put all that together, you plop out with rock music. And rock music is 50, 60, 70% jazz. Right there from the beginning. Okay, it's in there. When you listen to the Beatles, 50% of that is rhythm and blues, right? But they're not improvising like John Coltrane. They're not doing that at all. But the rhythm section, the choice of instruments, technically what people are doing, the idea of swing, the idea of groove, the use of the individual voice as a lead, you know, not trying to sound like a classical musician, but having your own voice. All of these things are innovations created by jazz. So I see rock music as being coming out of jazz. So it's very easy for rock to go back to jazz because it's in there. The one problem is with jazz is you've got the chord changes, you've got this sort of American song form which has come from the musicals. And with jazz musicians, they've learnt to play through the changes. With rock music, you're dealing with something that's come out of the blues, right? Because that's as much in there as well. This is educated, British, white, usually art student educated musicians open themselves up to blues musicians that have been discovered by an educated middle class in America. These are people like Robert Johnson and Leadbelly. This is what's going on. This is a white elite going to find something authentic in American music. Whether it is authentic, I don't know. I think the whole of it is all a wonderful marriage. But that's what you've got with rock music. Rock music starts to develop. There's a reason it starts to develop in the 60s is because there's a cultural shift and young people are looking for something. They don't just want their pop music to tell them, you know, how to chat each other up and drive around in cars. They want their music to have a message. They want it to express their new individuality because they're not going to go into the future like their parents did. They want things to change. They start to value self-expression, and the musicians want to express themselves. By this point, jazz has gone into a free jazz area, and that's all about expression, and that marries up much better. So bands like the Doors and the Byrds and Hendrix and all these bands are able to integrate now improvisation into their world. Cream do it. They become improvisatory ensembles expressing individuality and self-expression, and that's a thing that's really wanted in the 60s. So now we have fusion. It's sort of fusion is rock music rediscovering its roots and using that improvisational style that jazz has developed to expand its base, right? But it's also rooted in rhythm and blues, which is about groove, all right? So groove is very, very important to fusion. And I would say that is what fusion is, the extension of rock music by using improvisation, self-expression, and groove, right? It's also opening itself up, because free jazz was, to certain world music forms, African music forms, Indian music, North African music, Spanish, Latin, opening up to all those, and that's what fusion is. Fusion often follows a structure which has come from jazz, where you play the head, right? The head can often be a pop song format, and then you solo, and then you go back to the head. Rock music in the UK, primarily with the Beatles, but with a whole bunch of other bands like The Who and all that lot, they want to extend their reach. And if you're a British musician, you hit a problem, right? How does a British musician take on American forms, right? How do you do that? Can you really sing about levees and Route 66 if you're a white middle class British person? And so I think a number of bands in the late 60s start to take this on board, and they start to think, well, maybe we should be creating a rock and roll which actually integrates with the aesthetic of our sort of European, British aesthetic. In Europe, the European prog bands are doing the same thing. And that means you have to take out the American influence. And I think bands like Pink Floyd and then Jethro Tull are a blues band, but they suddenly start taking on the English aesthetic. You think of Jethro Tull and they were out now, blues band really influenced by, American jazz and blues forms. By the mid-70s, they sound like some medieval English electric folk band. Think of bands like Gentle Giants, think about Yes and then Genesis. It's the integration of non-Afro-American music forms into the music. That's the big difference. Can you improvise? Yes, you can. But if you're going to improvise, you've got to improvise in a way that doesn't ape that blues thing. Right? So a lot of the musicians that come out in prog, you think of the Robert Fripps, you think of the Rick Wakemans, they're not pulling on that blues tradition when they play, right? They're pulling on something else. Right, I've just got to, they're pulling on something. I'm just keeping track of the time because I want to try and keep this under 20 minutes, and I am garbling on, right? So I just thought I'd better have a quick look at my clock. We're into the last 5 minutes now, I think. I hope this is interesting for you. I lost my track there. Yeah, so the big difference between prog and fusion is the aesthetic. One of them is an extension of Afro-American blues and jazz forms through the rock angle. All right? The importance of improvisation in terms of the jazz language is very important, the language of jazz, and also the integration of groove is very, very important. Of course, if you try to extend out fusion at the same time that rock music's extended, there's going to be that little bit of European classical forms in there, a little bit of the integration of literary forms, non-love song subject matter, which is all the areas of prog. And this is where we start to get the grey area in the between, because certain prog bands are doing that more than others. Right, so if you listen to a band like Headhunters, they're a lot less proggy than Return to Forever are. Right, if you listen to an album like Apocalypse by the Mavish Nocturne, that's a lot more proggy than, say, George Benson's Breezing. Okay, George Benson's Breezing is much closer to American, Afro-American jazz and blues music forms and all of that history. Prog is really about the integration and extension of the rock genre using these non-American forms, and in the case of most progs, British aesthetic forms. And that's the big difference. Now, there is a whole area in the middle. So a band like Soft Machine, which we said originally are a fusion band, they are a fusion band, but they don't rely so much on the blues. They don't rely so much on jazz phrasing and licks. They're not so much rooted in the language of bebop. They're more rooted in, to some extent, the free jazzers like John Coltrane. But they're taking their influence far more from a guy like Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa is an anomaly because he sits as an American musician who seems to have equal influences from classical music as the blues, and he has a really strong blues influence and a really strong classical influence, and he creates his own world. So Zappa is almost like, is he fusion? Yes. Is he prog? Yes, he's both. So the truth is, it's very difficult to put a wall between these two genres. I was chatting to someone last night online, and they really were trying to do that and really trying to make it crazy. That fusion's fusion and prog is prog. Nothing's like that. Nothing in life is like that, right? In most cases, things tend to bleed from one to the other, and there is a whole bunch of stuff in the middle. But one of the things I've hopefully done with this video is, you could say, when you think of a band, you think of a band like Weather Report, for example, and you say to them, how much is that rooted in American jazz and blues? And you go, well, there's a big chunk of it there, but they've sort of fused that with world music. So but it's also fused with Joe Zawinul's sort of European folk music, and that makes it a slightly proggy. As soon as you bring those influences, it makes it slightly proggy. But also Zawinul has got a very strong European classical influence, and often when you listen to especially tracks like Birdland, or even more The Unknown Soldier, you can hear a non-popular music compositional form. So when you listen to The Unknown Soldier, which is basically split into three parts and sort of has this sort of concept about somebody brought up in a small village, and then they go to war and they experience war, then they come back to the village, but they're changed by war. That in itself, the utilisation of that as a sort of storyline or concept, that's very proggy. The utilisation of a sort of triptych structure, and the way you're going to take themes, extemporate on them, move away from them, and then come back to them, that's like a classical music structure. So The Unknown Soldier suddenly starts to seem a little bit proggy. Then there's all the experimentation with electronics. That makes it even a little bit more proggy, because that's one of the hallmarks of prog is pushing the boundaries sound-wise. So I should have said this as well, you know. Whereas with fusion, that is to some extent, but you can make fusion with guitar, bass and drums, you know, and stick to the sounds of rock and roll, and you can still make fusion. But with prog, there is always a need to push the boundaries technologically as well, which is something we need to throw in. So we do end up where, I believe, if we look at, say, The Unknown Soldier by Weather Report, we can say that is sitting really squarely in the middle of the prog and the fusion. But as we take a track like Teen Town, Teen Town has basically got a head, extemporization, and then it comes back to the head. The head is very bebop influenced in its phrasing. So that is far less proggy than The Unknown Soldier. Birdland is really harking back, I think, to a compositional approach that comes from Duke Ellington. It's very jazzy. But of course Duke Ellington had got that approach by taking the organisational principles developed by Louis Armstrong and applying a classical model to that, you know, which is why Duke Ellington then becomes the great composer. So what do we get as a conclusion at the end of this? Well, what it is that music weaves in and out. It's very difficult to just drop things into boxes. You know, the history of music means that certain music is borrowing already. The idea that, you know, you could take the blues and fuse it with African music is preposterous, because the blues is already a fusion of African music and, you know, American folk forms. So that idea of saying, you know, we can clearly define the point where people start to mix things, you cannot do. And also you have to go by case. You have to be very clear on what makes the prog genre what it is and what makes the fusion genre what it is. I'm going to end with what I think is the problem with this, is that what you had happen is in the 70s you had a number of prog bands emerge, and they made a lot of money because they sold a lot of records. They were very popular. I'm thinking, yes, Genesis, ELP, Pink Floyd. And what for many fans prog is any music that sounds like them. They are not linked in any way, shape or form. They do not sound like each other in any way. But if a band is sounding like any of those bands, then that's prog. If I start to go, well, what about Gong? Which are a very fusiony prog band. It's one of those, yeah, but they're not one of the main prog bands. You know, where's the Mellotrons? Where's the songs about wizards? Where's the 20-minute sidelong tracks? And anything that those bands did, they class as being the hallmarks of prog. And rather than identifying the tendencies that those bands have and see where they are utilising that in a different context. A band like Yes, of course, the Son of the Mavish Yorkshire hit, were massively influenced by fusion, and their sound changed. And then when Chick Corea returned to Creative returned to Forever and they plugged in, that band was massively influenced by Yes, it comes back. And so it weaves in and out. And what's interesting is taking it by case by case. But to try and argue it in generalities, it's not possible. Where have I got to? Has that helped? I doubt it. Because the whole point in having music is it's where we talk about aesthetics. And when we talk about aesthetics, we are talking about what we think is good and what we think is bad. That impinges on morality, right? And it's so important that we have these questions and we've got a safe ground where we can discuss this. When I discuss things like this, I'm actually talking about really, really important things, right? And if you take something like identity politics and just track in what we've been talking about, or even the idea of identity and tracking where what we've been talking about, you might find it raises some really interesting things. But I will leave that there, because we know we live in a world where you can't always say what you think. I will go now. I'll see you on the next video. Bye.